This next poem is by Wilfred Owen, who was one of the greatest of the war poets. And he was writing about the First World War, or the Great War, as they would have known it. The way these poets wrote about war changed people's perception of war. Owen's poetry is harrowing and searing, and it exposes the horrors of war. To use a line from one of his poems, Strange Meeting, he gives us the truth untold, the pity of war, the pity war distilled. Gone is the glorification of war that we saw in Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade. Owen's poetry gives us a startlingly raw insight into the reality of the First World War, and that reality is bleak. This poem, Exposure, is perhaps not one of his most famous poems, but it conveys, as its title suggests, the bare vulnerability of the soldiers. As usual, we'll read the poem and discuss what it's about. We'll think a bit about its context, and then we will annotate the poem, paying attention to language and form. Finally, we'll think about which of the poems you can compare it to in the Power and Conflict anthology. Our brains ache in the merciless iced winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory with the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles far off, like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn, massing in the east her melancholy army, attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. But nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause, and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassy ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires, glozed with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs. Shutters and doors all closed. On us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever suns smile true on child or field or fruit, for God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore not loath, we lie out here, therefore were born, for love of God seems dying. Tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands and puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party, picks and shovels and shaking grasp, pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. So what's happening in this poem? This poem describes life in the trenches and a group of soldiers who are hesitant to rest because they could be attacked at any moment. But on the contrary, they aren't attacked. Nothing happens, as it repeatedly says. And in a way, that painful weight is more agonising. There's a numbness as they try to get by from one moment to the next. But in a sense, the lack of drama, the lack of action, comes closer to the reality of day-to-day life in the trenches. They can hear the war in the distance, but it seems to come from some other world or be part of some other war. It feels very detached from them. They are existing at the mercy of the weather and the elements, which turn out to be another kind of equally dangerous enemy. Let's think about the contextual backdrop that gave rise to the poem, obviously, the war. The First World War has been one of, if not the most written about war in history. And what you must appreciate is the disjunction between the perception of war on the home front how it was presented and packaged in Britain, and the reality that the soldiers were presented with, which couldn't have been more different. There was a lot of propaganda to encourage men to enlist. There were lots of posters like that famous one pointing at everyone who passes saying, "Britain needs you." And these young men were sold a lie as to what signing up really entailed. They were led to believe that there was nothing more heroic, more noble, nothing braver than signing up to fight for your country. They were sold the boyhood dream of being a soldier, really, how honourable it would be to die for your country. But in reality, they were faced with some of the grimmest conditions ever faced by soldiers before. Because of the advent of tinned goods, tinned food, it meant that soldiers could be out on campaign all year round, unlike previously in history. So armies could be kept out in the trenches throughout the year, suffering harsh wintry conditions on top of facing the enemy. Also, the advances in technology meant there were heavy casualties. Soldiers were being bombed, gassed, and when they went over the top of the trenches into what was known as no man's land, they were marching against machine guns. As you can imagine, they were slaughtered. They were just all gunned down. There was nothing they could do. They were walking against automatic weapons. And the First World War really became a war of attrition, when you grind down the enemy to the point of collapse. Each side was just trying to diminish the other by killing as many as possible. And history remembers some of the First World War generals for their incompetence, leading to so many unnecessary deaths. Really, a whole generation of young men were just wiped out. Wilfred Owen enlisted in 1915, so 1 year after the war had started. After experiencing heavy fighting, he was diagnosed with shell shock, which was quite common at the time, and he was evacuated. In a war hospital in Scotland, he met Siegfried Sassoon, who already had a reputation for his poetry and who shared Owen's views of the war. Sassoon agreed to look over Owen's poetry and really encouraged him because he saw how strong these poems were. Owen returned to France in 1918, and in October he was awarded the Military Cross for bravery. On the 4th of November 1918, he was killed just 1 week before Armistice Day, or the end of the war, on the 11th of November. 1 more week, and he would have survived the war. His single volume of poetry was edited by Sassoon and published in 1920, so after his death, and it includes some of his most famous poems, Dulci et decorum est pro patria mori, Anthem for Doomed Youth, and many others like Strange Meeting and Exposure. The fact that Owen came so close to surviving the war, that tragic essence to the end of his life, it tinges his poetry, which is already haunting, with an infinite sadness and an infinite waste of potential. What other poems could he have written if he had survived? Throughout his poetry, including in this one, Owen strives to undermine what he calls the old lie in one of his most famous poems, which is the Latin phrase, Dulci et decorum est pro patria mori. How sweet and fitting it is to die for one's country. Owen's poetry shows us that's not true at all. It is neither sweet nor fitting to die for one's country. First, let's address the title of this poem, because there are different interpretations and connotations we could draw from it. Obviously, if you describe something as exposed, you are intimating that it is vulnerable. So it iterates the vulnerability of the soldiers. It also begs the question, what are they exposed to? Is it the enemy, the enemy's weapons, weather? There's another interpretation too. If we expose something, we reveal something that has been previously hidden, and therefore we could ask, is Owen exposing the truth of the war? There is, as I mentioned, a famous line from the poem Strange Meeting, when he talks about the truth untold, the pity of war, the pity war distilled. This could perhaps refer to the fact that he's exposing the truth of the war. Let's look at this first stanza. Our brains ache in the merciless iced winds that knife us. What device is this? Do you know? It's personification. Remember, personification is when you attribute human characteristics to inanimate or inhuman objects or entities. So in this, he is personifying the east winds as merciless and that the winds are stabbing the soldiers. That personification is immediately showing us that the first mention of violence in the poem isn't coming from the place we expect. It's funny, I just did an ellipsis there without thinking. And that's something we can comment on here. What do you notice about that punctuation at the end of the first 3 lines? There's an ellipsis, or a dot, 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 plural ellipses. If a piece of punctuation could embody weighting, then that piece of punctuation would be the ellipsis. And so what better way to indicate in this first stanza that this will be a constant theme of the poem? The soldiers waiting endlessly for something to happen or for something to change. So the ellipsis hints at the rest of the poem, but also it captures the state of endless waiting the soldiers are in. Wearied we keep awake. And then later as well, silent sentries whisper. Something we need to really pay attention to throughout this poem is the amount of onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeias using words that are similar to the noises of the words they refer to, or that create an effect through their sound. So throughout this poem, there's a lot of onomatopoeia, there's a lot of alliteration, there's a lot of repetition. And here we have wearied we keep awake. We have that W alliteration, which is quite difficult to say, wearied we keep awake. You trip over it slightly. And for me, the alliteration of W, it captures that feeling of numbness when the face is cold. You know, when your face is absolutely freezing and it's difficult to get your words out. That's what those W's do for me. Remember, alliteration is when words in sequence begin with the same letter. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, salient. Speaking of onomatopoeia, there's a lot of sibilance throughout the poem, but we'll come back to that. So, worried by silence, the sentry, soldiers standing guard, they whisper to each other, curious, nervous. Normally, there would be an and there. There'd be curious and nervous. But Owen has left it out. Do you know what we call that when we leave out a connective or a conjunction? We call it a syndeton. A syndeton. A syndeton is the deliberate omission of connectives or conjunctions when you leave them out. The opposite is polysyndeton, and that's when you overuse connectives. So rather than saying the soldiers were freezing, numb and scared, you would say the soldiers were freezing and numb and scared. As I always say, it's not enough to identify these techniques. You must then discuss the effect of the method you've identified. So often, for example, polysyndeton and a syndeton has what we call an accumulative effect that makes something seem bigger than it is. If I say I went to get some bread and milk and cheese and flour, it sounds more than if I say I went to get some bread, milk, cheese and flour. And a syndeton can also have that cumulative effect. And here then, it demonstrates how overwhelmed the soldiers feel and captures a sense of urgency, waiting for a possible attack. But as it says, nothing happens. As usual, we're going to discuss the structure later, but I want you to notice the last line of each stanza, how it is indented slightly, and it's much shorter than the other lines. We'll think about why Owen did this later, but also the most common refrain for the last line is this, nothing happens, is repeated throughout. And this is rare for a war poem, because here the focus, rather than being the battle and the fighting, is rather the lack of action. So the war can be just as horrific even when not experiencing direct combat. We hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. That simile creates a really sinister image. Even though it's describing the wind tugging on the wire, it recalls men caught on barbed wire. In the First World War, they would use barbed wire sometimes to trap men, and then they'd be caught by machine guns, and there would be this twitching agony he describes. His simile recreates the horror of that. And we have the flickering gunnery rumbles. He is very effective with his onomatopoeia. Finally, you have this isolated rhetorical question that captures the futility the soldiers feel. What are we doing here? What's the point of this endless war? The point misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sat. How many things are listed that they know? Do you remember what we call when we group? Sometimes people call it the power of three. Sometimes people call it a triplet. The fancy name for it, which I've mentioned before, is a tricolon when something is grouped in three. This tricolon shows what the day-to-day experience of the soldiers has been reduced to. All they know, all they are aware of, is the war and the rain and the grey clouds and the endless weather. It captures this grim monotony. When something's monotonous, it is the same always. Grim monotony of war and weather. That's 2 O's. Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army attacks once more. What is this another example of? It's another example of personification. There's a lot of personification in this poem. And again, it is personifying the weather. This personification casts morning as the enemy. And it shows the depth of the soldiers' despair, that each morning feels like an attack. not even by the enemy, but by the weather, by the greyness, by the bleakness. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. You can hear the hissing here, can't you? A lot of S sounds. Do you remember what we call that? Sibilance. Sibilance is the type of alliteration that uses S. There are different types of alliteration, and we'll go through them at some point. When you use B, K and harsh consonants or plosive, it's called plosive alliteration. Sibilance is using S, and it creates that hissing sound. As I said, you always need to address the effect of the method and make sure that the effect makes sense. I've had, for example, students say, oh, the sibilance of this line, it shows the despair of the soldiers. Not really, obviously. You've made a leap there without filling in the detail of how you got there. So actually make sure that if you're discussing the effect, it's plausible and it makes sense. So sibilance here, what's the effect of this sibilance? It captures the sinister hissing of bullets shooting through the air, and is therefore a constant reminder to the soldiers that there might be death nearby, which could make them despair, but you need to explain how you got there. You can't make leaps in your analysis. Less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow. This is a really important line. So yes, the bullets are dangerous, but they're not as deadly as the freezing weather conditions. This implies the biggest threat to the soldiers is the harsh weather conditions over the enemy. That is more dangerous to them. That is more of a threat to them than the bullets that they can hear far away. With sidelong flowing flakes that flock. Again, more alliteration. There's so much alliteration in this poem. The wind's nonchalance, more personification. The wind doesn't care. So you have that repeated personification of nature, casting them as the enemy. The wind and the weather, it doesn't care that it might be killing the soldiers. Hail flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. More alliteration and more personification. Again, reminding that the weather is a true enemy. Then we have this harrowing final rhetorical question. Is it that we are dying? The soldiers are therefore aware of the precariousness of the state they're in. And there's a real tragedy there. It could also be interpreted in one way. They are actually physically dying, that they're freezing to death, and they're aware of that. Or that the conditions are so grim that they feel like they're dying. It exposes the horror of the war through the soldiers' acute awareness of their mortality. They could die at any moment. Some of them wonder if even they are dying. Slowly, our ghosts drag home. They describe the soldiers in that way. Do you think it applies to the living or to the dead or to both? Do you think the living have been so affected and so traumatized by war they've become ghosts of their former selves? It shows what the soldiers have been reduced to by war, whether they are living or dead. Shutters and doors all closed. On us, the doors are closed. You have a lot of repetition there. Doors closed, doors are closed. And this perhaps captures the sense of isolation that the soldiers feel when they return home on leave or when they return back from the war. It reminds me slightly of a line from a poem by T.S. Eliot, one of my favourite poets, The Journey of the Magi. And he describes them returning to an alien people. When the soldiers came back from the First World War, it was very common that they felt completely detached from everyone else around them because no one could possibly understand what they had been through. And there was no way for them to put into words the horrors of what they had seen. And so I wonder whether there's a bit of that. Their old world has been closed off to them because of what they've been through. That's a possible interpretation. And in this stanza, you have so much loss of hope and loss of faith. So for them, kind fires can no longer burn. The sun can never smile again on them. They have become deeply afraid. And you have that final love of God seems dying. They have been through such horrors that they have completely lost hope and faith. I suppose also when you see so many dying, it would have had a lot of them questioning whether they or not they believe in God, that God could have let such atrocities happen. And this last stanza is really bleak. You have this burying party. So finally, the weather will catch them if they're going to freeze. And you have this really grim image of the burying party who are pausing over half-known faces. And there's something really quite depressing about that. And it can be interpreted in more than one way. They're pausing because they think, oh, actually, did I know this person? And they didn't have the chance to get to know some of them well enough because their life was snuffed out when they were so young. Or that they are unrecognisable in death. It could be one of those. So are they half known because they are unrecognisable in death, or half known because they never got the chance to know them? And you have this statement, which is intensified in the fact that there's this, it comes after a caesura breaking the line of poetry. All their eyes are ice. It conveys that very distressing quality of when someone has died. They're looking through unseeing eyes. Their eyes are frozen, they're no longer seeing. So it's an unsettling to end on, and a reminder of soldiers' fate. Because their life has been taken away, they're frozen and unseeing. And that final repeat, but nothing happens, that has been repeated throughout, because we keep coming back to this sense that the lack of action and the agonising weight can be just as destructive to the soldiers, especially when they face such harsh conditions. In terms of structure, this poem has a somewhat chaotic structure that parallels the chaos of the soldiers' circumstances. Each stanza has a rhyme scheme, A, B, B, A, C, giving a sense of a lack of completion that complements the listlessness of the soldiers. Notice each of the 8 stanzas has this truncated or shortened final line, which feels fitting when we think that the soldiers' lives themselves are being snuffed out or cut short. And obviously, in those final lines, you have that repeated refrain, but nothing happens, making the heart of the poem evident, the futility and agonising wariness of the soldiers. The poem is also full of para rhyme, which is similar to a half rhyme, and is when the final syllable begins and ends with the same consonant but has a different vowel. In the poem, knife us and nervous, or burn and born. So we, the reader or listener, are waiting for the full rhyme but are left unsatisfied in a similar way that the soldiers are waiting in vain because nothing happens, as it repeatedly says. So, which poems in the anthology could you compare it to? You could compare it to Charge of the Light Brigade, because both poems depict the soldiers' experience in conflict, and both could be interpreted as criticising the military leaders, Tennyson through the fact that someone blundered, and Owen through the agonising weight of the soldiers. Tennyson's does illustrate military action, however, even if that military action is a disaster, whereas the focus in Exposure is the numb waiting of the soldiers, and the leader's mismanagement of allowing soldiers to freeze to death. You could compare it to Bayonet Charge, in that both are very negative depictions of war and don't seek to glorify anything about war. However, Bayonet Charge is full of action. It's the account of a terrified and isolated soldier who is overwhelmed when confronted by the realities of combat. And in the heat of the moment, things like honour and patriotism drop like luxuries, as it says. Obviously, on the other hand, there is a distinct lack of action in Exposure. You have that repeated phrase, but nothing happens. But that lack of action is also detrimental to the soldiers. Finally, it's not a war poem, but you could compare it to the Prelude, because both poems focus on nature and its inescapable power over mankind. Both poems personify nature in a certain way, but Exposure personifies the weather as an army, whereas Wordsworth personifies the towering mountain as a human figure uprearing its head. Obviously, the experience of the speakers in the poem are very different. Owen's speaker is at war, and there is a camaraderie amongst the soldiers despite the grim conditions. There's no first-person singular I, it's all we, our, us. Whereas Wordsworth's speaker is entirely alone, you have that idea of solitude, and has an epiphany when confronted by the magnitude of nature. I hope this helped your understanding of the poem and makes you feel better equipped to write about it. In terms of power and conflict, Exposure is a very bleak depiction of conflict. And the root of conflict in the poem doesn't come from where you expect it to, this far-off war, but rather the elements themselves. Ultimately, Owen shows us that the horrors of war aren't limited to direct combats and action. There is as much horror in the inertia of soldiers suffering at the hands of the elements and in the soldiers' powerlessness over their own fate.